Hi, and welcome to Pydeal. This is going to be just a little demo of Pydeal, which is a simple GUI wrapper around the Python interpreter that I've created. It was inspired by a program called DreamPy, which has not been updated for recent Python versions, so I decided to try to make Pydeal to bring that workflow to the modern age. So the way Pydeal, basic essence of the interface is you have a two-pane layout. Up here you can write your code, and when you run that code by hitting execute or hitting control enter, the code runs, and down below you see the code itself along with the output that it generated. Now this is a multi-line edit, so you can type any big chunk of code in here. Notice it has syntax highlighting, bracket highlighting, and all that good stuff. You run it, you get your output. As usual in the regular Python interpreter, if your code ends with just a simple expression and you execute that, it'll interactively display the result, so you don't have to print it. And also, if you have if your output is very long, like this, notice that Pydeal will by default fold that. So it only shows you the first part of the output. It has this little button. Click that button to unfold it. Now you see all the output, and if you want to fold it again, you can right click and do fold. So that's useful if you want to hide long output, so you don't have to scroll past it, but still have it accessible if you do need to look at it. You can use the control arrows, so if you're in your editor, you hold control up, scroll back through stuff you already entered, control down, scroll the other way. You can also, if you click somewhere in the in one of your sections of code that you've already run, and then you hit enter, it'll copy that code back to the editor. This doesn't create a link or anything to where you copied it from. It's now just a new piece of code. You can make modifications to it and run it again and get it just like usual. Notice they have these numbers here that shows you what the cell number is, so that's handy because if you want the result that you calculated in previous cell, like here I calculated this value, maybe later I go, oh, what was that I did some long computation here and I just want the result without having to rerun the code. I can use these underscore variables like _3 because that's cell number 3, and I get that value back again, which is handy. There's also a search. This search panel lets you search for stuff, so what if you hit, you can find up and down. It'll find it within the output or within your code itself. The search is still somewhat of a work in progress. Generally it works. Sometimes it can be a bit slow if you have a lot of output, but it's handy. There's also separate tabs that are available, so if you're coding one thing and you realize, hey, wait a minute, I need to do some other code to figure something out, but you don't want to delete what you have because you want to save it and come back to it later, you can hit Control-T, open up a separate tab, run whatever you need to run, do whatever you need to do, and then go back and work on that later. You can close this with Control-W. You cannot execute multiple bits of code in parallel. You can only execute one at a time, but this just provides separate scratch pads for you to write the code and leave it there while you write some other code, and then you can come back to this. It has autocomplete as well, so if you start typing something, you can hit tab and get your autocomplete. If you import libraries, you get autocomplete there too. You can scroll around and choose the one you want. In addition, once you have something under your cursor, you can hit Control-H to get the documentation on the function or class that's under your cursor. IPython does this, so it'll work when and where IPython can handle it, which is not everywhere, but it does work. You can also hit Control-G to get the source code, if the source code is available. So this is the source code of whatever you have under your cursor. Obviously, if you try it on something that's written in C or doesn't have source code available, it won't be able to give it to you, but if the source code is available, you'll be able to see it. These panels, incidentally, for the source code and the documentation, these are all rearrangeable, so if you prefer to have, maybe you have your documentation and source code on the side or something like that, maybe you like to have your output above the code instead of below it. You can rearrange this as you please. These are also you can close them if you don't want the documentation and source code cluttering up your screen. You can hit Control-Shift-G, Control-Shift-H to get rid of those panels, and then they'll just bring them back later whenever you want. And all these commands in general that I'm mentioning, the keyboard shortcuts, most of the commands are also in the menu, so you can kind of discover what's available by looking through there, but you see they also have keyboard shortcuts. You can, if you, so when you run code, you'll see that the execute button is disabled while code is running. That indicates you can't run something because something's already running. So if you have something that's running too long and you want to stop it, or you got yourself into an infinite loop like I did here, you can go here to interrupt kernel, or you can hit Control-Q. That interrupts it as if you pressed Control-C in the regular Python interpreter. You can also restart your kernel. You want to start over and clear everything. You can do that. That'll restart. Now, Pydeal also has the ability to use different kernels. It uses IPython kernels. So this means you can use Pydeal to run different versions of Python that you have, say, in virtual environments or in Conda environments. Now, in addition, for Conda, Pydeal will look to see if you have Conda environments that have the IPython kernel installed, even if you haven't told IPython to register its kernel, for instance, the way you need to do to make it accessible through Jupyter Notebook. But Pydeal will Pydeal tries to find kernels that it can use, even if you didn't tell Jupyter, hey, make this kernel available, as long as you've installed the IPy kernel module in that environment. So you can do this. That clears your session just like restarting it, but instead of just restarting the kernel, it gives you a new you're running now a different version of Python, and you can do all the same stuff that you could do before. So you can only have one kernel running at a given time, but that can be whichever one you want. So Pydeal lets you use many different Python installations without having to install Pydeal separately in each environment. You only need to install Pydeal in one environment, and it can use the other ones. In order to do that, however, you do need to go into the settings. I'll show the settings here. There's a whole bunch of options for things like how many lines before you fold the output. You choose your font. There's some different color schemes and so on. But one of them is this Conda executable. So you have to tell Pydeal where you have Conda installed, and then Pydeal will use that to find those Conda environments and make them accessible as kernels if possible. You can also save your history of your session. It's saved as a Jupyter Notebook. I'm not going to save this demo session, but this is what it looks like. So if you save your session here, you can open it as a Jupyter Notebook. If you have a Jupyter Notebook, you can probably open it as a Pydeal session. Pydeal will ignore any fancy stuff that Jupyter Notebook puts in there, like graphical output or anything like that. But the code and textual output should be available. If you load a session, which you can also do, you can load the history. That does not run the code in the history that you load. It just loads the code and output and displays it. It basically adds it to your scroll back here, so you can see what code you use and you can work from that. But it doesn't run it unless you manually, retrieve that code as I showed before. You retrieve it and then you could run it again. So that's basically the Pydeal interface. One note about installing Pydeal: if you want to do it, I'm not going to actually run this command just because I don't want to wait for it to install. But this is how you have to do it. So Pydeal has to be installed with Conda. If you've got a Conda environment set up, you need to install it using channel Brenbarn and channel CondaForge. Brenbarn, that's my channel where Pydeal is, and CondaForge is needed for certain dependencies of Pydeal, in particular QScintilla, which is not available in the main Anaconda channel. So if you run this in a Conda environment, you'll install Pydeal, and then you just type Pydeal at the prompt to run that. So hopefully that was useful, and hopefully you'll find Pydeal to be a useful tool. Thanks.